Hello and most welcome to 1096 of the H series. It's a lovely late morning here and we are going into the subject of priming. My dear friend Professor Aiskens has shown me an article about priming and the mapping of thinking. Let me get into it. The article is called Biofield Physiology, a framework for an emergent discipline. It's written by Richard Hammerschlag, Michael Levin, Roland Cratty, and I won't name the rest, but I will try to put in a link to this article later on. Abstract. Biofield physiology is proposed as an overarching descriptor for the electromagnetic, biophotonic, and other types of spatially distributed fields that living systems generate and respond to as integral aspects of cellular, tissue, and whole organism self-regulation and organization. Medical physiology, cell biology, and biophysics provide a framework within which evidence for biofields, their proposed receptors and functions is presented. As such, biofields can be viewed as affecting physiological regulatory systems in a manner that complements the more familiar molecule-based mechanism. Examples of clinically relevant biofields are the electrical and magnetical fields generated by arrays of heart cells and neurons that are detected respectively as electrocardiograms, ECGs, or magnetocardiograms, MCG, and electroencephalograms, EEG, or magnetoencephalograms, MEGs. And I think especially the latter ones are the ones that has particular bearing here. As a basic physiology level, electromagnetic activity of neural assemblies appears to modulate neural synchronization and circadian rhythmicity. Numerous non-neural electrical fields have been detected and analyzed, including those arising from patterns of resting membrane potentials that guide development and regeneration, and from slowly varying transepithelial direct current fields that initiates cellular response to the tissue damage. Another biofield phenomenon is the coherent ultra-weak photon emissions, UPE, detected from cell cultures and from body surface. A physiological role for biophotons is consistent with observations that fluctuations in UPE correlate with cerebral blood flow, cerebral energy metabolism, and EEG activity. Biofield receptors are reviewed in three categories: molecular level receptors, charge flux sites, and endogenously generated electric or electromagnetic fields. In summary, sufficient evidence has accrued to consider biofield physiology as a viable scientific discipline. Directions for future research are proposed. Explanation will come. Introduction and overview. The impetus to frame a new area of physiology often arises at the interface of existence field of inquiry. As prime examples, neuroendocrinology emerge when nerve endings in the hypothalamus near the base of the brain were observed to release hormones that cue the anterior pituitary to regulate an array of endocrine tissues. Psychoneuroimmunology emerged when the phenomenon of conditioned immunosuppression was observed and when nerve endings were discovered adjacent to lymphocyte in secondary lymphoid tissue. Cognitive neuroscience came into its own when correlates of mental processes began to be identified by means of increasingly sensitive brain imaging techniques. We suggest that biofield physiology, with its initial focus on the characterization of endogenous electrical and magnetic fields as indices of health and illness, e.g. via electroencephalography or magnetoencephalography, EEG and MEG, or electrocardiography and magnetocardiography, ECG and MCG, represents another such confluence of disciplines integrating concepts and information from cell biology, biophysics, and medical physiology. Biologically generated fields, biofields, are spatially distributed set of forces and physical properties that have the capacity to encode information and exert instructive influences on cells and tissues capable of perceiving and being modified by them. As such, biofields complement molecular processes as a key contributors to what biophysicist Mai Wan Ho, PhD, describes as a global coherence, the multi-level integration of diverse biological activities across time and scale. In her view, global coherence, the defining quality of living organisms, accounts for the most salient properties such as long-range order and coordination, rapid and efficient energy transfer, and extreme sensitivity to specific signals. Just give me a second here. Although we focus in this paper on fields generated by living systems, there is a substantive scientific literature demonstrating that physiological regulatory systems in humans and animals are also affected by and even synchronized to environmentally generated fields, e.g. of geomagnetic and solar origin. Of additional interest, disruption in these fields have been observed to create adverse effects on health and behavior. A companion paper in this supplement reviews evidence for the therapeutic use of externally applied electrical and magnetical fields. For example, a recent Cochrane review concludes that pulsating allometric field therapy may offer some benefit in the treatment of delayed union and non-union of long bone fractures, a finding supportive of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approval of such therapeutic usage. We begin our article by describing known and postulated biofields, including how they are generated and which physiological systems may be affected. Next, we consider receptor systems that may detect, integrate, and trigger responses to both biofields and environmental fields. We conclude by identifying areas of future research, aimed at clarifying form and function of biofields. Overall, a case would be made that sufficient evidence has accrued to consider biofield physiology as a viable, if nascent stage, scientific discipline that is likely to expand the current biomedical model of health and disease. So this is, behind this very technical language, there's just amazing discoveries or discoveries, and they are pointing to now we can sort of mapping a completely different view of what is thinking, thoughts and planning. This is very similar to what we previously talked about when it comes to David Bradel, the workings of the cerebellum. And this, of course, fly completely into the face what generally was accepted or viewed as being the truth in neurology, but especially what we consider to be the truth in common sense, so to speak, of what thinking is. The whole idea of thinking be some sort of representation of life, the world, or things somehow, or that thoughts are substantial in the idea that there are existences. That can actually be seen on the electroencephalogram and the magnetic scan, and shown to be in itself adverse effects on the workings of the neurological makeup of the brain. I think it's a bit odd. Normally we think neurology as something that would be reductive to what ordinary thinking is. Here we have something that is just the opposite. We discover that thinking is incredibly much more than we generally think, which is in itself a very nice alliteration. Biofields, form and function. Every region of the body, however superficial or deep, is crisscrossed with well-studied communication and regulatory systems, including neural pathways, blood-borne hormones and exosomes, and immune surveillance. Yet the existence of fluctuating endogenously generated electromagnetic fields and other fields which also suffuse all our cells and compromise an additional rich source of biological information and regulation remains a deeply underappreciated aspect of physiology. Electrical activity in the form of charge separation is a fundamental feature of every living cell. As single-cell and multicellular organisms evolved in the primordial sea, the ability to maintain a low sodium, high potassium intracellular milieu in the face of the high sodium, low potassium concentrations in seawater served as a source of energy to enable uptake of metabolites and discharge of waste products across the cell surface. Proteins evolved to serve specific ion channels, and pumps maintain this ionic gradient, the resting potential between inside and outside of the cell. But evolution found greater promise for the resting potential than merely as energy source for ion pumps and cross-membrane transport of molecules. As multicellular organisms evolved, patterns of resting potentials of cells throughout the body became designated as instructive scaffolding to guide pattern formation and stem cell behavior during embryogenesis and organ regeneration. For example, endogenous arrays of bioelectrical potentials are now known to instruct left-right patterning, eye induction, size regulation, and patterning during complex organ regeneration. New tools allow these bioelectric gradients to be directly observed non-invasively in vivo, that is in life, and to be specifically altered to assess effects on intercellular communication and tissue level or organ level outcomes. Importantly, the molecular mechanism that couple changes in bioelectrical gradient distribution to downstream transcriptional and epigenetical targets are also being characterized. Further, as the advent of multicellular organisms led to increased cellular specialization, muscle and nervous tissue developed mechanisms to turn their resting potentials into high-speed action potentials, propagating along the cell surface with frequencies and other characteristics that encode information. Passage of this information from cell to cell via chemical and electrical synapses expanded the effective area of these electrical fields. Transmembrane currents in neurons also produce local electric fields that induced aphatic coupling, that is non-synaptic electric coupling, between adjacent axons, which influences the synchronization and timing of action potential firing in neurons. As further examples, various types of electrical fields created by either mechanical stress, which is piezoelectricity, or streaming potentials in bones, tendons, skin, and fascia are thought to regulate the functioning of osteocytes and fibroblasts to adjust the density and supporting tissues in response to loads. Also, electric fields generated by intracellular network of microtubules, centrosomes and chromosomes appear to play fundamental roles in regulating the dynamics of mitosis, meiosis, and a variety of other cellular activities. In addition to the high-speed electrical signals conducted along nerve axons, a second communication network based in ubiquitous epithelial cells conducts information as slowly varying direct currents. The DC fields generated by this system, which spread across considerable distances, play key roles in recognizing damage and guiding cell migration necessary for wound healing, especially in skin, heart, and cornea, as well as regulating the migration of neural pathfinding. Recent research has identified numerous molecular signaling pathways that mediate the interactions of these bioelectrical fields, first described decades ago with plasma membrane and cytoskeleton mechanism to facilitate tissue repair. So here all of a sudden you see a very close connection to thinking and general health. In bone tissue, fascia, that would be benväv in Swedish, senor, bone structure, leder, the general upmake of our cell membranes, our autoimmune defense, and so forth. This is quite amazing. I don't think if you were to say this, most people will say that you are actually mad. But now we are entering a different, well, let's call it a paradigm. listen to this. This paragraph is just for pure beauty. Since electric charge in motion, whether along a wire or a nerve axon, produces a magnetic field in the surrounding space, this phenomenon represents a further type of biofield. Magnetic fields emanating from the body, although extremely weak relative to the geomagnetic field of the Earth, are readily detected by superconducting quantum interference device, SQUID-based magnetometers. Evidence has recently been summarized that non-thermal electromagnetic fields of amplitude, similar to the cardiac field, can affect a wide variety of biological functions, including gene expressions, particularly in stem cells. Well, now we have the whole lot. It sees how the heart affects thinking, but also how gene expression can be actively changed by pure will or what sort of thinking we are doing. So you can compare here the normal attitude to thinking in academic circles and also in education is that it doesn't have any worth whatsoever. But here you see it is omnipotent, it's incredibly much important. And of course, connecting to what we said before, thinking about language, which is so debased, so undervalued in normal concourse, normal discourse, is gaining, of course, to be maker of the world. And therefore, if you don't correctly use language correctly, as the language game goes, you don't have access to the world, or you will have access to the world in a diminished way. And let's skip a couple of paragraphs here, and I'm going to another type of biofield phenomenon, and that is the coherent ultra-weak photon emissions, UPE. Not UFOs, but these are actually much more magnificent and interesting than the UPs. Detected from cell cultures and from the body surface. Since the initial observation of UPE or biophotons were detected from inflammation-producing reactive oxygen species, the level of these emissions has been explored as a non-invasive marker of metabolic stress and a measure of overall health. More broadly, such UPE, instead of being considered as metabolic epiphenomena, may serve important physiological roles. A role for ultra-weak light signaling in normal physiological regulation is suggested by the evidence of intercellular communication under chemically separated but optically coupled in vitro conditions, e.g. through a thin glass film. These studies have identified infrared as a primitive source of cellular vision to guide migration and other behaviors. Have you heard cells have vision? This flies in the face of all what we usually say about the makeup of the body. More recently, a role for biophotons in neural activity was based on observations that fluctuations in UPE correlate with cerebral blood flow and cerebral energy metabolism, as well as with EEG activity. Moreover, photonic stimulation at one end of the nerve appears to elicit increased UPE at the other end. As means of information transfer, Biophotons have the advantage of extremely high speed and the ability to penetrate into and through cell membranes and organs that present barriers to the diffusion of molecular signals. Non-conventional means of UPE mediating biosignaling include wave propagation within longitudinal oriented neural microtubules and passage through membrane-spanning regions of proteins that may serve as light pipes. Considerations of physiological activity of biofields also include resonance signaling, i.e. the modulation of cell function by specific electromagnetic frequencies, involvement of non-classical and quantum forms of energy, that is A fields and scalar waves, has not been explored to the same level of rigorous detail as the bioelectrical gradients and fields discussed above, and physiological roles for such phenomena had not yet been demonstrated. And here's another article that is being referred to. See the article, Biofield Science, Current Physics Perspective, in this supplement for more extensive discussion of non-classical and quantum forms of energy. A further challenge for framing a physiology of biofields is to identify endogenous receptor systems that detect electromagnetic and other types of fields and trigger responses to these non-molecular stimuli. While the concept of receptor brings to mind the conformational matching invoked to characterize receptor-mediated responses to hormones and drugs, biofield reception may be better described by phenomena from physics, such as resonance and impedance matching, based on tuning to signal frequencies. As previously proposed, 3 overlapping categories of biofield receptors can be considered: first, molecular level receptors; second, charge flux sites; and third, endogenously generated electric or electromagnetic fields. And here you see why the coherence of the fields are of extreme importance, not something to be generally ignored. And by not understanding this to the full extent, you can run into some pretty ghastly trouble. You need to affirmatively understand the functioning of the electromagnetic fields, because in a way that is the place for the thinking, and it can be clearly shown if you have the idea of representationalism, which is indicated here. You would have a severely adverse effect on the brain imaging. It can actually be seen, and I think this is the strongest proof directly from science why, for a human being in its biological makeup, it will hurt the biological makeup. It will have an adverse effect on the structure of our human body. And it goes down to cellular level. It covers genetic makeup. It covers the cells, which are actually both sort of subjects using light to direct themselves and communicate with others, but also to move about. You do know the cells in the body are moving about. They are not completely standstill. The few ones that are standstill are the cells in the nails, but they can be considered to be more or less dead. You can cut them off without any problem. Might be one of the most interesting findings I've seen so far, because it shows that we definitely need to expand what thinking is, and we need to put on language to a higher base. And this repetitious tendency in our current thinking is having a very negative effect on our whole body system. There are other articles that clearly shows that the autoimmune system, how your health is most characteristically affected by your thinking ways. And that factor seems to take overhand over all other factors whatsoever. It's the most important. I think this is rather interesting. There's a huge debate going on in the United States, for instance, for the use of marijuana. And they seem to be thinking that, I don't think marijuana has an effect chemically on the body or anything like that, but it does affect the thinking processes, and that leads to health. That's how to think about it. It's a drug, it's a poison in all aspects, but it's very positive when it comes to the effects for the whole body, and all the way down to the epigenetic factors, to the factors that regulate who we become. Because in each cell regeneration, and that happens rather quickly, some cells are slower, but some cells regenerate within a couple of months. I mentioned before the T2 muscle cells, they completely rejuvenate within 9 months. And that means you can change your complete makeup, and it can thereafter be clearly shown in these different instruments, machinery, especially the moving electromagnetical video. It's a sort of video how your functioning is working in real time, which is the most interesting, of course the most expensive machinery that ever existed when it comes to medical machinery. I don't even know the price of it. I would rather guess it would be in the grade of 20, 30, 50 million pounds, no less than that. It's extremely advanced, but there you can see directing thinking and process. And this is the very most important factor when it comes to health, and also shows how we create reality. Once more, you have the Klein bottle lurking about, the bottle that shows that the subject is co-creative in the object. They go together. And now we can look at that from a neurological aspect, and this is indeed a completely whole new field even. It's turning a page in what we think about human nature. And as you see, a division between mind and body is in itself having an adverse effect on the thinking procedure. It adds something, some sort of a division that is actually not present. It makes thinking or moving about or being a healthy being all the more difficult. Well, I continue with the article. I do apologize for it's rather technical, because it needs to be that way to be understood. So I go over to Biofield receptor system. A third challenge for framing a physiology of biofields is to identify endogenous receptor systems that detect electromagnetic and other types of fields and trigger responses to these non-molecular stimuli. While the concept of receptor brings to mind the confrontational matching invoked to characterize receptor-mediated responses to hormones and drugs, biofield reception may be better described by phenomena from physics, such as resonance and impedance matching, based on tuning to signal frequencies. As previously proposed, 3 overlapping categories of biofield receptors can be considered: molecular level receptors, charge flux sites, and endogenously generated electric or electromagnetic fields. And important studies on culture cells identify 2 examples of the first type of receptor site. Deoxyribonucleic acid, which is DNA, or the constituent chemical in DNA, and the cell membrane, which exogenous electromagnetic signals exert specific biological effects. Just as steroid hormones upregulate the transcription of particular genes by binding to hormone responses elements of DNA, pseudo-low-frequency electromagnetic fields appear to increase transcription of select genes by acting at upstream regions of DNA designated as an electromagnetic response element, EMRE. Deletion of the EMRE eliminates the ability of applied electromagnetic field to regulate the target genes, while other genes can be converted from electromagnetic non-responders to responders by inserting the EMRE at upstream regions. Similar electromagnetic fields, as demonstrated by the same researchers, appears to increase the activity of several membrane-bound enzymes. Charge flux sites, the second type of receptor, is exemplified by the perturbations of transmembrane calcium fluxes, have been proposed as a generic mechanism by which weak electromagnetic fields affect biological systems. If voltage sensitivity of calcium ion C2+ channels facilitates the targeting of these sites by electromagnetic fields, voltage modulated channels for other ions should also be tested as potential target sites. Low-frequency electromagnetic fields have also been proposed to interact with DNA by accelerating the movement of electrons within the helical arrays of base pairs. Changes in charge separation in small DNA regions occur during aggregation, so that the interactions may be pronounced in specific active segments of DNA. While ion channels and ion pumps have major roles in establishing the resting potential of an individual cell, it is gap junctions, the specialized electrical connections between adjacent cells, that allow voltage and current-mediated signals to be propagated across groups of cells. In this manner, spatiotemporal patterns of resting potentials arise to provide bioelectrical guidance during this tissue development, regeneration, and cancer suppression. Yes, there is a very clear connection between how you think and your susceptibility to cancer. This is especially clear from the electroencephalograms and the electric magnetic scanner. Although it's not yet apparent that applied weak electromagnetic field can alter resting potentials, let alone affect multicellular patterns of membrane voltage. Applied weak electrical currents do appear to induce regeneration of adult frog limbs. You see? It would even induce bettering in effect in the adult frog limbs. These exogenously applied currents are comparable in direction and density to the outward electrical currents detected from regenerating amphibian limbs. And it is possible that some of the reported effects of applied electromagnetic fields are due to modification of endogenous bioelectrical gradients. A final candidate for receptor systems for endogenous and exogenous biofields is a body-wide network that appears to exhibit all three types of potential receptor sites: molecular, charge flux, and endogenous field. Unspecialized loose connective tissue, often referred to fascia, forms a continuous head-to-toe network surrounding and permeating all tissue and organs. This fascia is incredibly important, and I think to the general public is just not known, although it was a short focus on it about 20 to 25 years ago. Nobody knows about fascia, but fascia are incredibly important. And just thinking of the body without fascia is incredibly dangerous to the health, because that means that you don't take that into concern. Remember the lesson from the couple's carnival. How we think about our bodies are also how we move the bodies. And exerting the fascia, it is incredibly disastrous for our bodily makeup. We are just looking into what fascias are. They are clearly connected to thinking, moving about, directionality, and also the spatiotemporal structure. The spatiotemporal structure of each body system or each closed system is its health. It is less complex spatiotemporal when there is less thinking health. Less thinking health always, no exception, always mean less bodily health. And less bodily health always, no exemptions, means less thinking capacity. Normally, well, this is proven, normally in academia and education, it seems to be some absurd division between how your body feels and how you're thinking. Now we know the quality of thinking and also factors like spatiotemporal effectivity, the level of spatiotemporality. And the very idea, this old-fashioned idea of the spatiotemporal to be outside of the body is disastrous. I realize more and more this is pure catastrophe for the whole system to have that conception. But that conception is also a sick way for the body-mind system to working. So it's very hard to see which is the hen and which is the egg. They come simultaneously. With the establishment of a classical physical model of the world and with time and space being outside, you sicken in the same moment. And you could sicken first, and that will develop the same Newtonian spatiotemporal structure. This is what this paper is trying to explain. And some more things as well. Really glad for Professor Jan Heiskens to send me this article. It's incredibly interesting. It shows opening of a new field. It'll be interesting to see what a person like Ian McGilchrist were to think about this rather marvelous exploration into the unified field of body and mind. We soldier on. This could be called an extracellular matrix, structured mainly by collagen fibers. Fascia, I'm talking about fascia now. Fascia provides a supportive and regulatory framework for all organs of the body, as it coordinates cellular perception and interpretation of mechanical forces. This extracellular system reaches into the interior of cells, all the way into the interior of cells, via transmembrane bridging molecules known as integrins, which allow for information from the fascia to modify the cell, metabolism and genetic activity. So no longer do we have the Dawkinian model of genes being external to the rest of the body or external to the mind, which is an abandoned archaeological idea of how we work. Speculation on the nature of such collagen signaling focuses on water molecules, hydrogen bonded along the outer shell of the collagen triple helix, oriented in a manner that supports the rapid jump conduction of protons along the length of the collagen fibers. Since the collagen structures both conduct and modify photon pulses emitted from biological sources, it is conceivable that signaling along collagen fibers serves as a surveillance system of endogenous biofield emission to complement the immune and nervous systems in monitoring tissue health. Further speculation based on the water-protein relationship along collagen fibers invokes quantum coherence, a state that can occur when all water molecules in a particular domain or region are spinning synchronously, emitting spin or torsion waves. This is very akin, of course, to the rotation of the electron. Such spin coherence and quantum coherence enable the collagen matrix, which is the fascia, to be ultrasensitive to electromagnetic fields in a manner that can be frequency selective due to a quantum phenomenon known as the Larmor precession. This effect, resulting from the torque of an external magnetic field exerting on the spin on subatomic particles, is the basic of magnetic resonance imaging. A word to remember, MRI, if you haven't memorized that before. Known sensitivities to organisms to extremely small environmental cues, including visible light and electromagnetic fields, merit consideration in this overview of biofield receptors. These sensitives, which evolved, for example, to locate prey, avoid predators, navigate and sense changing weather patterns, often operate at or near limits set by physics. An exemplar is the ability of the retina to detect a single photon of light, which occurs via calcium channel mediated signal amplification and allows thousands of calcium ions enter a retinal rod in response to an individual photon. Did you hear that? Individual photon. Now it's proven That is the quantum processes going on at the very lowest level, affecting the whole system, an individual photon. Do you remember what big thing it was then when it came that an individual photon could be detected by the robin, which was discovered like 15 years ago, taken up by Jim Al-Khalili. Now we know that goes for the retinal rod in our eyes as well. So we are like the robin. The public health debate concerning potentially harmful effects of electromagnetic fields was influenced for decades by the conventional physics doctrine that living systems could only be affected by energy strong enough to cause ionization or heating of tissues. In contrast, evidence that very weak non-ionizing electromagnetic fields exert biological effects is well documented, and the history of the shift away from the thermal model has been chronicled. Finally, German researchers have demonstrated that individual molecules can act as transmitting and receiving antennae in the mediation of efficient intermolecular communication via single photons. Now it comes to the conclusion, and I will add a commentary to this because this is pure gold. I'm a bit taken aback actually by the realization what we have at hand. Conclusions. Sufficient evidence has accrued to consider Biofield's physiology as a viable scientific discipline based on non-local integrated information conveying phenomena as well on emerging molecular details of localized biophysical interactions, endogenously generated pulses of ultra-weak photons, electromagnetic fields directly related to cardiac activity, and patterns of distributed membrane voltage are varied forms of physiological activity designated as biofields, each with established properties and proposed biological functions. Several receptor systems have been identified that mediate responses to these biofields. By analogy with the hormones, receptors and regulatory functions that compromise endocrinology, components of the biofield physiology framework are in place. In seeking to define biofield physiology as an area of research, it is helpful to distinguish it from the existing discipline of bioelectromagnetics, and to consider the two approaches as different phases of the continuum. If bioelectromagnetics is more about defining mechanisms of local interactions, then biofield physiology is more about understanding the integrated longer range functions within the whole organism, the former more reductive, the latter more integrative. Biofield physiology is still at an early stage of formation. While it is incontrovertible that biological systems emit and react to a wide range of energetic influences, we have not achieved a detailed understanding or mathematical modeling of the essential field aspects of such interaction, a prerequisite for exploiting their long-range organizing properties. Moreover, many of the experimental findings are preliminary, while biofield studied are varied in forms and cannot yet be considered as interrelated representatives of a clearly defined system of biological self-regulation. Further, much of the research appears guided by existing paradigms of biochemistry and physiology. As one example, evidence of DNA response elements that respond to specific electromagnetic frequencies, analogous to DNA regions responsive to specific hormones. It is an important finding. However, biofields may also act in a more dispersive, non-specific manner to activate self-regulatory systems that in turn stimulate surveillance to detect the source of tissue imbalance or disease. A future research is likely to reveal such imbalances may be understood via models based on either molecule level or biofield level dysfunction, a perspective that will further expand diagnostic treatment options and our concepts of physiology. And here are some directions of advice, but I'll put in some commentary here because I think it's about time to sum up at least this part of the article. Well, here we see that thinking, especially today, we have a big problem with autoimmune diseases. Things like obesity, anorexia nervosa, bulimia, things like schizophrenia, also autism. It is a clear connection here. How you think, how is the quality of your thinking, and how your health is. It can no longer be separated thinking as something fleeting about. And even more interesting, it can be shown, it is not clear that the so-called ontic take on life or the Newtonian classic physics is not a malfunction of the system that produces this shadow effect of the Newtonian XYZ and T line. So that is actually a result of not functioning properly, and is not the idea of it is being rational, clear, or anything like that is pure nonsense. I would say that's I do not want to use the terminology of Dawkins, but you can call it like a meme, but in a gestalt way. A meme that gives sickness, and that sickness is transferred from generation directly to next generation. And I think this autoimmune disease can be shown that classical physics is in itself an autoimmune disease, because it clearly runs havoc on the thinking process, and it makes thinking in a projective manner impossible. And what I usually call the reappearance or the regurgitating or rumination of the past. It is not a rumination or regurgitating of the past. It's a malfunction. That's simply what it is. And we usually call it thinking or planning. But putting pieces together of past is not thinking. It's a malfunctioning of the system, or functioning on a very low level. And this low level functioning is something that we shown when we looked at how astronauts gets affected by living in empty space, in zero gravity. What happens to these people after they get this sort of damage or their functioning goes down is that they create all without influence from any literature or education, they create a Newtonian universe. That's a malfunctioning that comes from the body being affected, body-mind system being effective. This is what Ian McGilchrist would call trying to capture reality, to grasp it. And that grasping is a muscular tension in itself. And it also have this deterministic, involuntary side. So determinism, predestinations, we mentioned that previously with the Jansenist. It is coming from the system. It's not an ideology. It's pure nonsense to call it an ideology or a philosophical worldview. It is actually directly coming from the malfunction. It's a shadow effect. And now we can see it directly in a moving MRI. It can be shown it's a malfunction and nothing else. So you see it's a malfunction lying at the very base of our thinking system. A sort of trauma that could have happened somewhere 500 or 600 BC. And that was transponded from generation to generation. And if the body-mind system is affected adversely, it will produce these shadow effects. And I did not use the word shadow intentionally, but it is actually the shadow effect of the cave metaphor of Plato. It is the same thing. It's a disastrous worldview, but it can only be transported from body to body. No Indian can read a book about Newtonian physics and become ill. That simply won't happen, especially if he's not affected by Western culture before the age of, let's say, 15, 16, something like that. After that, we're not sensitive to those influences. It's a trauma that your body-mind system directly puts into the other person, your child or your next of kin. And it's also a collective thing coming from the whole society as a unit. So yeah, I'll continue with the next step of the motion here. So we continue with the conclusion here, and then I will go over to priming. I think priming flies in the face of all philosophical and ideological development in the Western world, and it's very important to understand that nobody can be aside of this. These are quantum effects, so no matter what sort of ideology or religion or sect or stern belief you try to have, you will be immediately affected. I think some people could be excluded to this. I met some of these, but it is extremely unusual. Today, the absolute majority of the population in the Western Hemisphere show up T2 muscles, and even more so N2 neurons. So the effect of thinking is already there, and that will not open up for this more complex understanding of the nature. You get a polarity that is very crude with the T2 and the N2 neurons. There's nothing wrong with contradiction as such, but they're bound to be crude, too simplified, and they will obstruct understanding to a very great level. But isn't it great? Here we see it's a totality of the whole system. So now some advice for the new field. Interrelation of endogenous biofields with major physiological systems. While there is a broad acceptance that the nervous, endocrine, immune and cardiovascular systems are in continuous intercommunication via electrical and molecular signals, the possibility must also be considered that endogenous biofields act as carriers of information between these systems. An exemplar is the heart-brain interaction, where several types of cardiac initiated signals appear to exert sequential effects on brain activity. Electromagnetic signals from the heart reach the brain in relatively instantaneous manner, followed first by a range of neural signals arriving in millisecond time frames, and subsequently by pressure waves and hormonal signals arriving with delays of seconds. So you see, this electromagnetic transport is quicker, much quicker, so we don't have to look at all the neural transmittal, which has been the paradigm until now, I would say. For me, I didn't know about this. So this is a very good reason I bring up this very advanced article, because it still shows to something much bigger than we could even imagine. In general, different types of signals mediate rapid/short acting versus slower, longer lasting responses, e.g. Neurally released adrenaline and hormonally released corticosteroids, respectively coordinate the stress response. Physiological requirements for the ultra-rapid responses may be met by biofields. As research continues to identify physiological roles of endogenous biofields, a wider lens should be used to examine whether and how biofields may have intersystems integrative roles in the physiological regulation. And for instance, that's the fascia, but also how the cells and the molecules work in the body. Relation of biofield mediated physiological changes to health and healing. In regard to human health, biofield research has taken two broad directions aimed at establishing salutary and detrimental effects of biofields and biofield therapies. Caution is recommended regarding attempts to draw correlations between biofields and health based on present data. For example, a recent review of biophoton detection as a potential non-invasive means of health assessment stresses the need for standardization of devices and conditions used to monitor this UPE. Epidemiological assessments of adverse effects of ambient electromagnetic fields face critiques common to such long-term correlational studies. Future results on biofields and health needs to include a state of the science physiological endpoints that best reflect clinical conditions. Very important. Such research will benefit from advances in calibrating biofield therapy practitioners and biofield devices, as well as from improved methodology for designing and implementing appropriate controls. At the frontier, many of the hypotheses gathered for this paper are at present at the leading edge of speculation, but they are offered with confidence that emerging technologies will eventually be able to either validate or refute them. As an instructive example, Pienta and Coffey stated already in 1991 that cells and intracellular elements are capable of vibrating in a dynamic manner with complex harmonics, the frequencies of which can now be measured and analyzed in quantitative manner by Fourier analysis. In the decades since that statement, other technologies have been developed to characterize ultra-fast activities in the molecule fabric of the fascia or living matrix and or ground regulation systems, and something called wetware. As a final thought, new insight into the properties of water and application of a quantum field theory will undoubtedly contribute to a deeper understanding of the relationships between biofields and molecular dynamics. Raman, and infrared spectroscopic techniques are now enabling rapid and sensitive chemical characterization of samples based strictly on vibrational signatures of the molecules present in a sampling volume. When applied to biological systems, the techniques provide highly complex spectra that document changes taking place in the entire genome, proteome, and metabolome. Real-time in vivo applications are possible. So this is opening of a whole new field. I would say that this will also... Здравствуйте! And here is an article, 4th of August, so it's quite recent, coming from the well-renowned magazine Neuroscience. Summary: passive exercise increases cerebral blood flow and improves executive function, providing the same cognitive benefits as more active exercise. A new study by kinesiology graduate students from Western Ontario, has found passive exercise leads to increased cerebral blood flow and improved executive function, providing the same cognitive benefits as active exercise. And this was published in Psychophysiology. The study is the first to look at whether whether there would be benefits to brain health during passive exercise where a person's limbs are moved via an external force. In this very case, cycle pedals pushed by a mechanically driven flywheel. During a 20-minute session with healthy young adults, the team assessed executive function at the baseline before participants exercised, and compared the data post-exercise, after exercise that is, of course. They found an improvement in executive function of the same magnitude for both the passive and the active exercise conditions, without an increase in heart rate or diastolic blood pressure. Executive function is a higher order cognitive ability that allows people to make plans and supports the activities of daily living. People who have mild cognitive impairments, such as people experience symptoms of early stage Alzheimer, can find their executive function negatively affected. Previously, research has documented that active exercise, where a person activates their muscles of their volition, can increase blood flow to the brain and improve executive function. Passive exercise also increases blood flow to the brain, but this is significantly less documented because of the ruling paradigm. In terms of passive exercise, we can only hypothesize the outcome because this type of research had not been done before, said Matthew Heath, professor in kinesiology and supervisor of the study. During passive exercise, a person's limbs move and the muscles receptors are being stretched. That information is sent to the brain, indicating that more blood is needed in the moving areas of the body and in connected regions of the brain. This increase in cerebral blood flow, while significantly less than with active exercise, produce executive functions improvements of similar magnitude. An exciting result for the researchers. A quote from Heath here: "The potential impact for people with limited or no mobility could be profound. If done regularly, the increase in blood flow to the brain and the resultant improvement in executive function will optimistically become a compounding effect that has a significant impact on cognitive health and executive function." Further study could be improved by looking at whether the benefit to executive function persists at long intervals of time post-exercise, as well as by the inclusion of more diverse participants. Heath and team see great potential. So let's go into the abstract. Passive exercise increases cerebral blood flow velocity and supports a post-exercise executive function benefit. Executive function entails high-level cognitive control supporting activities of daily living. Literature has shown that a single bout of exercise involving volitional muscle activation, that is active exercise, improves executive functioning, and that an increase in cerebral blood flow, CBF, may contribute to this benefit. It is, however, unknown whether non-volitional exercise, that is passive exercise, wherein an individual limbs are moved via an external force, elicits a similar executive functioning benefit. This is a salient question given that proprioceptive and feed-forward drive from passive exercise increases CBF independent of the metabolic demands of active exercise. Here, in a procedural validation, participants n equals 2 use a cycle ergometer to complete separate 20-minute active and passive. Then, of course, the flywheel is mechanically driven. Exercise conditions and non-exercise control conditions. So the 3 different exercises or conditions taken into the movement. Electromyography showed that passive exercise did not increase against muscle activation. Or increase ventilation or gas exchange variables. This is a salient question given that proprioceptive and feed-forward drive from passive exercise increases CBF, that's cerebral brain fluid, independent on the metabolic demands of active exercise. In the main experiment, participants complete with the same exercise and control conditions, and transcranial Doppler ultrasound show that active and passive exercise, but not the control condition, increased CBF through the middle cerebral artery, albeit the magnitude was less during passive exercise. Notably, anti-saccade reaction times prior to and immediately after each condition show that active P less than 0.001 and passive exercise P equals 0.33 exercise improved, and oculomotor based measure of executive function, whereas no benefit was observed in the control condition. Accordingly, results evidence that passive exercise boosts an oculomotor-based measure of executive function and support convergent evidence that increased CBF mediates this benefit. So this shows that priming is at the base of how we move our system. And it's odd that this is the very first experimentation on this, or one of the first. I think there have been a few before, but it is incredibly interesting. And this shows in context with the earlier article I read, that ignoring the thinking side will have incredible effects on health and reality. And the whole idea that the reality is outside of us is in itself an effect of a diseased system, a system that is not in balance. And that can be healed, and I mainly think about the PRI of John Apleton. I'll try to look a little bit into that. I fill in here with an article from John Apleton and Pete Green. I think some of you are already familiar with them. And it's called Life on the Edge of the Dorsal Ventral Seam. Introductory comment: control of the body, unity with the body, and freedom in the body are concepts that are arguably necessary for graceful movement and efficient structural support. Yet, this is interesting, they can also seem antithetical to each other. For instance, how can there be unity in the body as well as freedom in the use of various parts? The conflict encountered by the joining of these concepts is resolved by the concepts of elasticity, a tendency of the body to return to its original shape after it's been stretched or complexed, and flow. Elasticity suggests flexibility combined with resilience, and flow seems to describe a quality of gracefulness. But how does a control system in the body elastically direct flowing body movements? Where is the unity in the body and where is the freedom? Is the freedom at the joints of bones or elsewhere? Excuse me. Sorry about that. Let's continue here. Pinpointing the source of grace, elasticity and fluidity and so forth would seem elusive. However, I venture here that one major mechanism, if not the major mechanism, for graceful transfer of control and direction in the body takes place, or rather should take place, along the dorsal ventral seam. To begin to learn what that is and to more easily understand the ideas written ahead, I have a quick look through the illustrations in this paper and then return. Within the Alexander technique, graceful movement and graceful weighting, that is inhibition, are generally thought to be the result of appropriate control of impulses in the relationship of the head, neck and body. That may be largely true, but other relationships are at work as well. Below are the three descriptions of other control systems operating in the body that I propose and have written about. One, and this is important because this shows the antithesis in thinking, and it also takes connection to Heraclitus. Because Heraclitus does not mean that antithesis is in language alone or in the world alone. It is in all place. And this is in contrast to the division that sort of gets established later on among the pre-Socratics, Parmenides, and so forth, where all of a sudden everything becomes impossible to understand. So of course there is an antithesis paradox in the body system, just there is one in quantum mechanics. There is strictly no difference. One, the relationship between the dorsal and ventral surfaces I mentioned. Two, the relationship between three functional segments of the body, the director, motor and rudder segments. These control systems include what is called primary control within the Alexander technique, and what I have called secondary control, which involves our tail section or rudder. All these things are in use in East Asia, for instance. They are not mentioned because of the simple fact they never had the pre-Socratian paradigm shift. So that they never had a division, and therefore there was no development of malevolent thinking and movement, because they go hand in hand. There can be no classical physics with a smooth movement. There cannot be graceful thinking, graceful movement, and a healthy body with a monocemic outtake. That is outrageous to claim such a thing. And that is actually part of the classical physics, if you do claim that. But we carry on here. The relationship between the eyes and primary control. This relationship is related to the subject of this paper. Let's move into the dorsal and ventral surfaces. Before describing the value and function of the dorsal ventral seam, it is important to understand where the dorsal and ventral surfaces are located on the body, as well as how they neurologically function to encourage, dictate optimal postural support. We are all two-sided. In a figure that I will add the whole article to the descriptions. Figure 1 shows the dorsal and ventral surfaces on human figure and several different animals. The dorsal ventral seam is the edge where the white and dark gray meet on various animals and the human figure. The dorsal is shown as the white surfaces and the ventral is shown as the dark gray surfaces. On horizontally oriented animals, the dorsal surface is on top, though may still be called the back of the animal. On upright humans, the dorsal surface is described as being on the back side. This is partly true, but not entirely accurate. First, significant portions of the dorsal surface on humans are not on the back side, the legs, arms and face, for instance. In addition, in healthy posture, the dorsal surface on humans in most of our activities is also oriented more upward, if even only slightly, than the ventral surface. This is important because healthy response to gravity requires a predominance of this relationship, where the dorsal surface generally faces more upward than the opposing side, the ventral surface. Remember the fascia, this ignored most important part of our system. When ignored, they start to deteriorate and will produce T2 and N2. And since we have a pre-established concept or a gestalt already before we start education, and something already always established in our Western Hemisphere, you will be affected by this. And the more you venture into the area of philosophy, ideology, religion, you will worsen the case. Just as Plato did, Aristotle, he went more and more into the cave and made things worse and worse. We need to stop somewhere and understand that a fault was made, and that fault needs to be looked at. And it cannot be looked directly verbally, because it needs to be healed at the same time, because the fascia is responsible for understanding itself. Understanding is a body movement, not a calculation in our head. We cannot put, as a colleague of mine said, a ship and then you learn French immediately. Our system does not work that. It's not situated. We are not computers. It's a very primitive and naive analogy to compare human beings to computers. Why would there be computers? This is just absurd. Computers is a new thing. What we will have in 200 years will be the new analogy and will be as bad. And look at how we compared earlier on with clocks and steam engines. See that mistake for what it is. It's a tendency to grab anything that's around you and say, this is the origin of everything. I am not aware of a complete delineation of the two surfaces illustrated anywhere else, like I have created here. It was later found in Chinese physiotherapy, which was really odd. So it can be shown, but it's not necessary for the East Asian to have it shown, because they never had the new paradigm. So they don't have a new body map. They didn't think that the body was unity. And since you don't allow paradoxes in the body, you will have a problem, as if you don't allow paradoxes to work properly in language or in physics, the physical world. Let's get into the dorsal ventral seam. that is the frontier between the darkened areas, the below areas in animals that are primitive, and also in human beings. This is where thinking starts. This is where directing starts. Remember what I said earlier on, fascia and the microtubules are responsible for thinking, not located in the head, Richard E. Lynn think. And trying to think with all things like memories and such, we know that is adverse. That is no thinking at all. Might work in some crude cases like building something with Lego, but it doesn't work in real life. It's way too limited. Figure 2, you can have a look-see, you can have the article next to you, shows an even more simplified archetypal direction of the dorsal and ventral surfaces on what I call a BIRAG view of the tetrapod, which include human surfaces. This method of showing the two surfaces makes obvious the outer edges of the body that I call the DV seam. Incidentally, when conceptualizing the dorsal and ventral surfaces and the seam on yourself, include a suggestion of a tail, since we do have a coccyx or a historical tail with musculature and nerve fibers associated with it. Figure 3, have a look-see at that, or take out a stingray. Shows the living creature that is perhaps the most useful in clearly displaying much of the concept of dorsal ventral surfaces and their appropriate relationship, as well as the concept of the dorsal ventral seam and its major importance. The two-sided stingray has an unmistakably defined dorsal and ventral surface, except for the area of the eyes. The ray also demonstrates considerable activity that originates along the edge between the dorsal and ventral surfaces, the DV seam. The dorsal ventral seam, or boundary in scientific terminology, is arguably the most important features of all animals. Along this important narrow zone, most of our senses lie. Nostrils, eyes, ears, our limbs develop from this zone. They are our means of perceiving and interacting with the world around us. Only our tactile and kinesthetic sensing function as well in areas other than along the dorsal ventral seam. This is all interesting intellectually, but now that you are familiar with the dorsal ventral surfaces on a stingray and a human, at least it's time to experiment with an image to experience tactile kinesthetic sensations that can seem much more valuable. Imagining new features on our dorsal ventral seam. The following imagery exercise can be experimented with, whether sitting or standing, though sitting up on the edge of a chair or leaning slightly forward may be the easiest to imagine that you have fins or wings, like the stingray starting to grow from the DV seam all over your body. You read that the right, you are developing what you might think of as flanks or thin fins all along the seam. Perhaps imagine the growth extends only 2 or 3 inches outward of the body. They occur around your arms, down your sides, around the sides of your head, and back around this small tail. This includes, in a smaller version of the fins, between and around the fingers and toes. In addition, imagine that the growths also run up both sides of the neck to the base of the ear, along the seam to the head and face as shown in figure 1. This will probably require looking back at illustrations for some guidance. For people who are new to posterior release imagery, here are a few pointers. As you imagine changes along the seam, and expansion and contraction on your dorsal and ventral surfaces, you will indeed pass through many feelings, sensations, and all will feel like different postures, movements, stretches, and sways. Do not judge them initially. All of them are right, because they represent loosening changes from your habitual postural and movement patterns. And at the same time, all of them are wrong, because you do not want to be permanently frozen in the new pattern either. We are not working towards right or wrong so much as we are looking for healthy, peaceful, and free. A body we like right now. Allow the movements and feeling to take place, even if you don't understand them or don't particularly want to feel them. Just allow and trust the old and the new feelings. Look at them with your mind's eye for a bit. Try and then succeed in moving the sensations around a bit by imagining. Think about tension and moving out of edges, then farther than the edges. Even the pull of the edges in the form of fins out from the seam, elastically extending the seam. So, in short, all movement take place within the dorsal ventral seam. And by imagining fins coming out 2 to 3 inches, this distance that would be 7.5 centimeters or 8 centimeters, you can sort of project that or prime your body/mind. And this affects both thinking and movement at the very same time. And this is natural for all East Asians. They all move that way, and all animals bar zero in the animal kingdom. This is the natural way. And because we establish an ontic mood and a whole conopia of thinking of the world outside us, we damage our bodies. It's inevitably there will be bodily damage if you infer a division between inner and out. But there need to be a contradictory division within the body, because it's these contradictions that move the body. Think about the stingray. It moves in a flowing movement. It is like flying, not swimming. This is why the stingray is such an excellent tool in showing the movement. Earlier on we did the same thing with a snake, but I would say it's easier to imagine how the stingray moves. They do move in the same fashion, but it looks like a snake moves by wriggling. It doesn't do that. It's not wriggling its mood. But of course, when we have the classical mechanical goggles, this is what we're going to see, because all perception is classical mechanical, and most people testify to see distances. I would say that is like a symptom. Something's wrong. It is not really something that can be understood. Once you make the whole movement from classical physics to quantum mechanics, you will not understand what you earlier understood. You have no idea what it meant to be classically physically. You would just be relieved of a state that was malicious to you. Figure 4, the stingray has limbs, wings, fins that are extremely expanded or stretched edges on the front, back and sides of the body. The core of the body is much smaller and is more convex or raised on the dorsal side, and flat, concave or slightly hollowed on the ventral side. Within our own bodies, a sense of a core that is raised on the dorsal side and flat or hollowed on the ventral side encourages the ideal relationship between the two surfaces. And of course, better structural support and posture. Watching a small video here can help identify several qualities of movement and structure. 1. The distinction between the body core and the edges. 2. Locomotion and wave motion originating along these edges and advancing to the core. 3. Core stability, though not rigidity in movement. 4. Refined and specific movement isolated in one part of the body. So imagining is now coming to the paragraph, next paragraph. And imagining and priming are similar. And see here what we do with our system when we start to think the world is out there and that it is monosemic. We are thereby priming the system to be non-active or defunct, which is true to what's happening. Passivity is not the right word. Malfunctioning is more correct, because we don't even achieve existence, we don't achieve properties or anything. And by priming us in this way, we prime the system to be malfunctioning. This is a necessary new priming. Without this priming, your whole body-mind system will remain in the old one, without any chance of change. No change can happen before correct contradictions are established. This is why it's so important to understand that Heraclitus is not teaching. It's not a phony joker, and it's not dark as Aristotle claimed, or obscure. It's just the opposite. This is where clearance comes from. If you're imagining your new fins or wings moving a little but not too much, it should produce a relaxing and releasing feeling to the core area of the body, and perhaps more. Imagining these seams or fins moving on one portion of the body and then the next portion until you can envision the changes in more general sense about your DV seam and the whole body. Success with generalized light movement of the wave or the wave of the DV seam. Fins or wings can take practice and time, but some success and surprise is likely if you devote yourself to the image. The images on figure 6 that follow represent the two surfaces on any four-legged creature, as well as a human, from the tip of the lips to the tip of the tail. See how it looks in a human being? Tip of the lips, tip of the tail. The DV seam imagery is about several structural and muscular adjustments as well as new pleasant sensations. Not only can a sense of release in one area of the body or another take place, but also a sense of appropriate tension or increased tone, which is very important, can be developed along the seam, but not within the body core. This is very important. Do not make goals of yourself. I see many people try to stretch themselves. This can only be done by imagery, and once you start to understand that imagery projection is both bodily and mental at the same time, and you realize, and this is part of the subject object sides in the Klein bottle, you will understand this is the making of the world. This is collapsing of the superposition. And it also goes that our communal friend the doctor who doesn't understand Schrödinger's cat. This is inbuilt in his whole system. No understanding can come until he liberates himself from this fixation with what he would call existence. But he would all the same say it didn't make sense when he develops into this freer individual. And unless doing as we are constructing to do, no understanding will come. And you will suffer bodily harm, which is the example of today with repetitive strain injury, autoimmune afflictions, and so forth and so more. It's a lot today, and it's progressing exponentially, becoming more and more, so to speak, advanced, more damaging for the whole row. So there is a natural way that we function that involves contradictions. Heraclitus understood that within the Milesians' discovery of physicos, or the natural world, there lie a problem if perceived too directly. Avoiding that problem by allowing contradictions to be forceful, because if you go too much into the physicoi, contradictions could no longer be allowed, as with Parmenides and Xenophanes. They were taken out of the picture, no more possibilities for an understanding. So you see the connection here. It's very interesting that Heraclitus and of course Wittgenstein and Heidegger also foresee this, but they go even further. But it's good now we have solid scientific proof on top of what we previously have come to understand. And now you also see that quantum mechanics is an absolute necessity for a healthy body. Without it, it cannot be a healthy body system at all, because that disruption between mind and body is in itself a symptom of a non-working system. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.